Even heaven isn't ideal. Total and perfect completion is not even conceivable, let alone achievable. Bruce Charlton. One of the reasons that some people do not want salvation and post-mortal eternal life in heaven, is that heaven is imperfect and incomplete. For example, not everybody gets to heaven, so that some people we want to be within heaven, will not be there. A related imperfection is that some of those who won't be in heaven will be suffering, and this can be seen as an imperfection, in that we can imagine a reality without suffering, and yet some kind of hell will continue to be forever. So, for these and other reasons heaven is incomplete and imperfect, and may be rejected on these grounds. Yet if heaven is rejected as a goal for such reasons, then, presumably, this is because something better is imagined and desired. However, all conceivable situations are incomplete and imperfect. We cannot coherently conceptualize a state of perfection and completion, and therefore cannot really desire it. For instance, the idea of oneness spirituality is an attempt at conceptualizing a state of perfect completion, the idea that in reality all is one and there is nothing lacking. Yet this is incoherent because there is, at least, the fact that we recognize a lack of oneness in our yearning for it, and if all is really one there could be no such lack, or yearning, or even self-awareness. If our dissatisfaction is put down to delusion, then how could there be delusion in a state of oneness? If reality really was one, there would be nothing else. If the incompleteness of heaven, the fact that it leaves out some, or much, of reality, is to be solved by conceptualizing a future state of the perfection and harmonization of every being, including every being and thing left out of heaven, then the necessary, divine, power to perfect and complete reality is being assumed to be constrained by delay. For some reason. And that reason is itself a breaking of oneness/perfection/completeness. If all is one, why has perfection and completion not already been achieved? Why must we and others continue to suffer its lack? For that matter, if perfection and completion really are attainable by God, then why create anything else than perfect completeness? What is the point? Why should deity create this imperfect and intermediate world with its entropy and evil, and where all gratifications are incomplete and temporary? That itself, whatever the answer proposed, is a break of perfection and completeness. My point is that, although we may imagine and desire perfection and completion of all reality, this wish is incoherent and cannot, even theoretically, be attained. The insistence on total, perfect completion is indeed a disguised form of double negative ideology. I mean that perfection is actually the negation of our divine impulse towards creative love, which is a dynamic and developing thing, future-orientated. Instead of regarding this fundamental quality of being as an attribute of reality, the lack of a permanent state of perfect completion is reinterpreted as a problem. A problem that is insoluble, because it negates creation, life, consciousness, love. The same for completion. Completion is a negation of the potential for eternal growth, development, increase of love. There is no end to creation. But this possibility is being reinterpreted negatively, as a current state of incompletion. The insistence upon completion is, again, a denial of the most profound nature of reality, which is why it leads nowhere but paradox. In sum, when people reject heaven because it is incomplete and imperfect, they have fallen into a trap, a spiritual prison that has no escape. Incoherence is a reductio ad absurdum, a conclusion revelatory of false premises. No escape except by becoming aware of, examining, and rejecting their most fundamental, metaphysical, assumptions regarding the nature of reality. Free will is not the cause of evil. Bruce Charlton. It is a mistake when Christian theologians explain evil in terms of God's gift of free will. because free will is not a cause of evil. I mean, free will is not even potentially a cause of evil. Evil comes from evil, evil acts come from an evil nature. A good man would be free, but would do no evil. Proof. Jesus Christ, he was free and did not evil. If men also had good natures, men would freely do only good. Therefore the cause of evil is the nature of things, the cause of evil in men is the evil nature of men. If, therefore, you believe that God created everything from nothing, ex nihilo, including men, then this entails that God must have created the nature of men capable of evil. This has nothing to do with free will. Free will does not come into it. But since God really is wholly good, and also men obviously do evil, then it follows that God did not create men from nothing. The evil that is in men's nature is not of God. Thus there is something within men that is not of God. Conclusion: men are not wholly created by God. And the notion that God created everything from nothing is refuted. The second coming induces this worldly hopes of helping Jesus unify heaven and earth. Francis Berger. In a recent post, Dr. Charlton outlined the hedonic therapeutic, right-left axis of morality in the following manner. Quote, "And this is why the left sees itself as a higher morality than the right, in that therapeutic alleviation of suffering is seen as more sophisticated, altruistic, compassionate etc., than trying to create as much positive emotionality as possible. The right sees our finite life as something we should make the most of, for ourselves and some others, the left as something we should get through with the least misery, for ourselves perhaps, but mainly justified in terms of therapy for others." End quote. In a comment on that post, I applied the right-left axis to organized Christianity. I sense that it has tended more toward the therapeutic side of things, much to the chagrin of traditionally minded Christians, who want to get back to some church-centered form of society in the hope that it will solve modernity. Whether right or left, one thing is certain: organized Christianity is focused primarily on this worldly motivations and aims. I have often wondered why that is so. One possible explanation for such an obsessive focus on this world may lie in the doctrine of the second coming, the culmination of God's purposes in creation and ultimate plans for humanity. A quick and easy way to think about the second coming is to consider it as a mass restoration and resurrection event in which Jesus returns to earth from heaven with the express mission to unify heaven and earth. One problem with the second coming doctrine is that it essentially diminishes Jesus' time on earth, to say nothing of his creation of heaven, and subsequent offer of everlasting life to those who choose to believe in him and follow him. The second coming implies that Jesus did not accomplish all he had set out to accomplish during his first coming. It also dilutes the intensely personal nature of choosing to follow Jesus and turns it into a mass resurrection event in which all will be judged and dealt with accordingly during the end times. The second coming also lessens the next worldly, life after death aspect of Jesus' offer of everlasting life in heaven, because in the future Jesus will incorporate this world with the next one to establish his eternal kingdom. Thus, the second coming creation of a unified earth heaven is superior to Jesus' first coming creation of heaven separated from the earth. Anyway, returning to the point I wanted to make, organized Christianity, whether right or left in morals, is predominantly this worldly focused, and the this worldly focus may have much to do with the doctrine of the second coming. The underlying thinking seems to be centered on the idea that Jesus will return and set everything right, once and for all, by unifying heaven and earth. In the meantime, we should do everything we can to help expedite the inevitable by making the earth as heavenly as we can. For Christians on the right end of the axis, This involves making the most of this world by reinstituting old-time religion with its emphasis on re-establishing a theocratic social order complete with rigid doctrines, authority, and hierarchy. Such a social order/world would, ultimately, make everyone better. Left-axis Christians, on the other hand, see the alleviation of suffering and negative experiences as the means through which to make the world more heavenly. N.T. Wright consistently provides a vivid example of this sort of left-axis therapeutic strain and how the Second Coming influences it. In an article published during the height of the Birdemic, Wright proposed the following, bold and underlining added.
The point of new creation, after all, isn't about life after death in the normal sense. We are promised that when God creates the final new heavens and new earth, all his people will be raised from the dead to share in it, after an interim period, about which the first Christians weren't particularly interested. But the new creation launched at Easter was about the present this worldly reality. So here's the difference. If you promise the post-pandemic world a spiritual experience of Jesus here and now, or a heavenly life after death, most people will shrug their shoulders. That's not going to help rebuild the economy. It won't provide jobs for the millions now out of work. It will be cold comfort for those who have lost loved ones. We would be at the same place as Martha when Jesus challenged her about the resurrection, John 11:23-25. Yes, she says, I know my brother will rise at the last day. Jesus' response is what we need to hear right now, I am the resurrection and the life. Resurrection isn't just a long distance, far off hope. Nor is it about going to heaven, it is a person. And he, has come forward from God's ultimate future to burst into the present with new life and new hope. That was, and is, the message the world needs. Ever since the 18th century, the Western world has done its best to squash the rumor of Jesus' resurrection. That's hardly surprising. The gospel stories are about the climax of world history and the birth of God's new creation. But the so-called Enlightenment believed that history reached its climax, not with Jesus, but with the European and American culture of the time, and that its own science, philosophy, and democracy had produced the real new world. There cannot, after all, be two climaxes to history. The Church, tragically, has gone along for the ride. We decided to leave the practical work of new creation to the secular authorities and content ourselves with, guess what, cultivating personal experience and otherworldly hope. As Nietzsche saw, the Church has offered a form of Platonism with someone called Jesus loosely attached. That's a comfortable place to be. No secular empires are challenged in the making of that movie. But the Church is supposed to be offering comfort to others, not seeking it for itself. The post-pandemic world needs the real Easter message, the message of a new creation which began when Jesus was raised from the dead. A new heaven and earth reality, energized by God's powerful new breath surging through Jesus' followers, turning them, to their own surprise, and in some cases alarm, into a multicultural, outward-facing community, determined to be the good news the world so obviously needed. Paul's great vision in Ephesians was of God summing up everything in heaven and earth in the Messiah, 1:10, a reality anticipated in the coming together of Jew and Gentile into a single family, 2:11-22, sending a signal to the powers of the world that God is God and Jesus is Lord, 3:1-13. When Paul said that we are created in the Messiah for good works, he didn't mean so that we could behave ourselves properly, though that's obviously implied too. Good works in Paul's world meant people making a positive difference in their wider communities. The Church has no business outsourcing its heaven on earth mission of hope to secular agencies. We should be upstaging them. Fortunately, this is already happening all over the place. The Holy Spirit is often way ahead of the Church's teaching and preaching. In my country, Christian groups have led the way in initiatives like food banks. The use of cathedrals as vaccination centers, not, of course, as an alternative to worship, but as its natural outflow, has sent a powerful signal. The Church is there for the healing of the community. Again and again, the Church in practice has been what St. Paul said it should be, people of prayer and hope at the places where the world is in pain. But this cheerful, outward-facing life is easily blown off course or diverted into the wrong channels. To avoid that, the real resurrection message needs to be grasped, preached, and lived. The world changed when Jesus of Nazareth came out of the tomb on Easter morning. It takes precisely the same faith to believe the truth as it takes to roll up your sleeves and go to where help is most needed, from the soup kitchen in the below the tracks parish, all the way to the World Economic Forum. After all, the Easter stories in the Gospels do not end up with people saying, "He lives within my heart." Nor do people say, in those first stories, "Ah, That's alright, so we can go to heaven after all. They end up with people saying, Jesus is raised, therefore new creation has begun, and we have a job to do. There is a straight line from the heaven on earth reality of Jesus' resurrection to the heaven on earth vocation of his followers. By his Spirit, we can be the difference the world needs. We can make the difference the world needs.
Necessity does not obviate the requirement for repentance. Bruce Charlton. As Jesus apparently tried to make clear, following him to resurrection ought to be about repentance of all sin, not the literal impossibility of ceasing from sin, nor even the salvific irrelevance of ceasing from some list of particular sins. Because they have the idea that Christians are supposed to stop sinning, or at least reduce it considerably, self-identified Christians are too often very concerned to explain that most of their sins are trivial, that it would be unreasonable to expect that they be ceased, or that this kind of sin is necessary, that it is unavoidable to sin in some particular way. The subtext often seems to be that because sins are trivial, coerced, needed, then they are not really sins, and don't really count. Not so long as big sins, murder etc. are avoided. It's not that this is false, in a way, but that such arguments are essentially beside the point. The truth is that mortal beings on this earth, in the actual situations we find ourselves, just aren't aligned with God's will, with divine creation, and that is sin. We can't validly enumerate sins, because life isn't divided up in that way. Thoughts, speech, actions etc. are linked. There aren't qualitative separations between sins, or between sin and virtue. This is because the underlying reality is motivation to be on God's side in the spiritual war, and nobody can be on God's side all of the time in all situations. What we are required to repent is all the ways in which we diverge from living wholly by love. The idea that we need to avoid, or strive to avoid, some particular list of sins is wrong. And the idea that someone who avoids the worst sins is set up for salvation is likewise a mistake. It doesn't matter how good we are relatively to others, in the ultimate and vital sense, we are all sinners. All that isn't fatal to salvation, because Jesus came to save sinners, which is another way of saying he came to save potentially all men who follow Jesus, acknowledge that they are sinners, and know what would be needful not to be sinners. But while we live, while God maintains us alive, we must have useful work to do. That work isn't stopping sinning, but part of it is discerning, acknowledging, and repenting sin, whenever possible. This is just a byproduct of knowing what we ought to think, say, do, and knowing that we aren't doing it, and that we would do it if that were possible. This is particularly important when it comes to the sinning that we are incentivized, coerced or even compelled to do. For instance, my favorite example, untruthfulness, dishonesty, lying, deliberate misleading of others by repetition, hype and spin, and by selective omissions. Nearly everybody does this a lot of the time, and the leadership class and most professional class people, including priests, pastors, ministers and the like, do it for a living. They do it much of the time, and they must keep doing it if they want to get and keep their jobs. Indeed, calculated and systemic untruthfulness is essential to much modern work, mandatory for employment, necessary to obtain and retain one's position, and get prestige and promotion. A very large slice of the modern population therefore lie for a living. These are sins that are active, purposive, obtrude into our consciousness many times every day. People do them, and have zero intentions of stopping doing them. Indeed, they could not stop doing them without abandoning their responsibilities. Without giving up. And even then, they would still be sinning in innumerable other ways, and would very likely be required to commit more of other kinds of sin. In practice, stopping one sin very often entails ramping up other sins, and the balance between decrease and increase is often unclear even when not negative. The first thing to acknowledge is that there is no way out of this, as we actually are, on this mortal earth. The second thing to realize that the many and various excuses of why we have to do sins, do not make any difference to salvation even when they are perfectly true. What we should do about all this is quite simple, and described in the fourth gospel. We start with our commitment to follow Jesus to resurrected eternal heavenly life. And recognize that this will require us to be remade and transformed into beings of love, which also, negatively, means becoming without sin. As Jesus explained to Nicodemus, is only possible on the other side of death, we must die and then be born again. Therefore, one of the most significant things we can do, here and now, in this mortal life, is to notice and acknowledge when we are actually sinning. This is important for our salvation, and the state of our souls, to acknowledge this actual sinning, much more important than to focus and expend our finite efforts and attention in, oh so admirably, diminishing one or a few selective sins, in what Jesus might have called the Pharisee strategy. Showing off about one's supposed immunity to this or that temptation or sin may be an effective way of manipulating other people. It might, less often, even be a good thing for particular or overall social functioning. But is not the way to learn spiritually, to improve one's soul, and it has almost nothing to do with salvation. If the requirement for repentance is regarded in this way, then we will all find that there is no shortage of material for learning. If we are not much tempted by one kind of sin, there are plenty of other sins which we are doing some or most of the time, and which we have, for whatever reason, good or bad, have no intention of stopping. And there are sins that because of our nature, and or circumstances, we cannot stop, we do not have the ability to stop. Jesus Christ did not ask the impossible of us, indeed he made salvation possible for anybody capable of love. Ultimately, those who attain resurrected eternal life need to desire themselves to be remade wholly good, without sin. We can't do this on this side of death, but can always and everywhere be learning what that will entail. This is time well spent. Each and every recognition and repentance of our sin is both an affirmation and strengthening of our ultimate commitment to follow Jesus after death, and also a small but significant, proximate betterment of our souls as they now are, and shall be carried forward into eternal life. Detachment and Indifference. William Wildblood. A couple of weeks ago I saw a television program in which an Indian man who had been living in England since he was a small boy and who was, to all appearances, completely westernized went back to India in order to find acceptance for the death of his father to whom he had been extremely close. The shots where he recollected his love for his father were very touching. He came from a Hindu family but was now an atheist due, no doubt, to the influence of the world in which he, a successful journalist, lived. But his father's death had awoken something in him, and though he neither sought nor expected easy answers, he did want to explore his traditional background. The way he chose to do this was to join a pilgrimage to the Kumbh Mela, which is a festival that takes place every 12 years when Jupiter, the Sun and the Moon form some kind of astronomical relationship. The gathering is the most enormous collection of human beings on the planet, and wild horses couldn't drag me there. But for many it is the highlight of their lives. Tens of millions of people attend, forming a chaotic mass of humanity, and for Hindus it is one of the holiest events, with people making many sacrifices to go and bathe in the river Ganges, where they can purify themselves of sin and prepare their souls for moksha, which is liberation. At least, that's the idea. I remember reading once that one of Ramakrishna's disciples asked him if bathing in the Ganges really did wash away your sins. "It certainly does," he replied. "The trouble is the sins sit in the branches of the trees on the riverside and, unless you are attentive, drop back on you as you come out." A good answer that satisfies both faith and reason, sort of. In the last post I talked about the need for detachment at the present time. There is always a need for detachment, but the fact of the end times makes it more important than ever. I spoke of it meaning not that you don't care but that you are not attached to the caring. This might seem a contradiction in terms, so let me explain. You care because this world is real, but you are not attached to the care because it is not ultimately real. This world is a reflection of a higher world. That doesn't mean it's not real, but that its reality is borrowed, not innate. The true reality, from which springs any reality this world has, is located in the higher world. In the heart of God, you might say. I mention this because as the journalist in the TV program was going to bathe in the river of the Kumbh, there was a stampede. Hundreds of people were injured, and dozens died. Naturally, he was horrified and he sought an explanation of how to react from the spiritual perspective from one of the many sannyasis who were present at the event. Unusually, this was a holy woman rather than a holy man, but she wore the ochre robe that signifies renunciation from the word. She told him to respond with indifference because birth and death were all part of life which is eternal. This is fine as far as it goes, but the problem is the English word indifference carries the meaning of being, well, indifferent, that is to say, not caring about the pain and suffering there is in the world. You might consider this is just a question of the concepts of one language and culture not transferring accurately when expressed in the terms of another, and there is certainly an element of that. I suspect the word she would have used if speaking in her own language would have been vairagya, which is a Sanskrit word meaning detachment and dispassion. It describes the spiritual state of being unattached to worldly matters of any kind, including ideas and beliefs, because one is centered in the eternal reality of being, above all the ebb and flow of events in the external world of space and time. It is not a question of the suppression of desire but the transcending of attachment to it. This is an essential quality to be acquired by any spiritual aspirant, Eastern or Western, that involves transferring the locus of attention from the phenomenal world of cause and effect to the stillness of the spiritual plane, which is the underlying reality behind all the movement constantly going on in the material. In classical Indian philosophy it is understood that dispassion does not negate compassion, that, in fact, properly ordered dispassion opens up the path to real compassion. However, there is a tendency, and this seems particularly the case for the Indian mind, for dispassion to actually mean, or result in, real indifference. That's why India is famous for its combination of spirituality with material squalor and degradation. Admittedly, it can be hard to balance detachment with caring, but that is the task we are set, to be detached from the world but love it all the same because of the spiritual. Jesus wept. No one knew the reality of the spiritual world more than Jesus, but that knowledge did not cut him off from the suffering in the material world. I suspect that when this holy woman spoke of indifference to the deaths of many men and women at the pilgrimage, she really was largely indifferent. I don't judge or condemn her because it is challenging when removing oneself from the world and transferring conscious attention to spirit to retain concern for the world. That is why there is always an element of balancing opposites on the spiritual path, of not going too far in one or another direction but standing on the edge of the razor-sharp path. We must have detachment from the world, but we must also have detachment from ourselves. Then we will find, or so I have been told, that love arises. Initiation by participation in imaginative fictions. Bruce Charlton. When we really participate in the process of reading a work of imaginative fiction, we undergo some of the steps of what is sometimes termed initiation. A typical work of imaginative fiction starts out in the everyday and mundane world of ordinary people and perceptions, the business of survival, seeking comforts and pleasures, avoiding suffering, delaying death. Then, usually by identification with one or more protagonists, the fiction takes us through rising stages of expanded experience. 1. The strange and marvelous, things beyond everyday experience, perhaps experiences that induce exceptionally powerful emotions. 2. Exceptional but normal living people, kings and queens, lords and ladies, heroes and heroines. 3. Animals and plants, and nature, an awareness that there are more than people in the world. Befriending animals, maybe mutually communicating, and the same with trees, landscapes, and perhaps ancient buildings or monuments. 4. Fairies and the like, an encounter with sentient beings that are not human, such as elves and dwarves, or threatening talking beings like dragons and giants. 5. Beings of higher consciousness and spiritual power, such as great holy men and women, seers, wizards, enchanters, magicians. 6. Experience of meaning and purpose in reality, being guided by contacts, synchronicities, the workings out of prophecy, at a higher level the workings of divine providence. 7. Experience of contact with deity, angelic beings, gods, and God. Not many fictions have all of these stages of initiation, and perhaps not in this ascending order, and fewer will even attempt to evoke a sense of participation, the highest levels of holiness, ultimate purpose or the divine. Low-level stories will be contented with adventures among the strange and marvelous, and contact with ordinary humans but of special prestige, and if they do include higher beings, then these are treated reductively, just means to a materialistic end. At the highest levels of imaginative fiction, there will be indications of the higher levels, whether explicitly or by implication, i.e. enchantment, the opposite of reduction, when for example experience of identifying with strange places or talking animals points at the reality of higher levels of initiation. It is these high-level imaginative works that provide, potentially, the most transformative initiations. If it isn't how the best, and ideal, families work, then it isn't how God works. Bruce Charlton. So much false, distorted, and misleading information in and around Christianity, and human attention and abilities are so limited, that we need ways of swiftly recognizing and disposing of clear wrongness, regardless of the vast volumes of teaching and commentary that affirm the wrongness. Because of human inattention and inability, the most effective way of disguising and perpetuating wrongness is by combining complexity and abstraction. Therefore, our best antidote is to keep things personal and direct. Christians have the great advantage that Jesus made it clear, in the teachings and recorded behavior of the close friend eyewitness account of the 4th Gospel John, that we should think of God's relationships with men, in terms of a family. Since nearly everybody has sufficient experience, backed by innate knowledge and instincts, to know how an ideal family ought to behave, then we can evaluate statements/assertions about God and divine purpose by this family comparison. Such a comparison disposes of a great deal of common, mainstream, official, and traditional assertion about the basis structure of the plan of salvation for mankind in context of the spiritual war of this world. In particular, we can infer that salvation is not really a plan, at least, not if a plan is the kind of thing that is used by a national military leader in order to win a war. The proper analogue of victory in the war of this world ought to be, not one nation defeating another, but, the salvation of an individual person, which is their transformation into resurrected eternal life in heaven. This fits with what Christian committed parents wish for each and every one of their beloved children. Such parents are not seeking a spiritual group victory, analogous to the material victory of a tribe or nation, because such a victory would reasonably, and necessarily, require the spiritual sacrifice of one or, almost certainly, many of their beloved children in order that the family as a whole might defeat their enemy, and triumph in some, hoped-to-be, overall way. However, loving families don't aspire to work by such spiritual sacrifices. They do not consign one or more children to damnation, perhaps hell, in order that the others, or the group as a whole might be saved. No. Instead, ideally loving families would seek always for the best, spiritually, for each and all members. The family conceptualized as a group is of secondary concern, and the unit of family is derived from the individual members and their mutual love. The family analogy reveals the wicked ultimate consequences of talk on the lines that God has already won the spiritual war of this world, or the common assumption that salvation is groupish, of tribes, nations, mankind. Such talk is analogous to saying that a nation has already won a war, despite that fighting continues and thousands are still dying and being hurt and maimed. Such a statement makes sense in terms of the primacy of nation, but when individual beloved persons are primary, then a war is won only person by person. And a war continues uncertain for as long as there are any persons whose spiritual destiny is not decided. So, in following Christ, the only victory is the salvation of particular persons, and such victory is actually an eternal transformation of that person's nature, and this is not an end point for him, or the world, but a new beginning. Life itself, family life, where the persons involved are all eternal beings, is the unending participation of each individual in ongoing divine creation. And divine creation is an aspect of love, the consequence of love, the purpose of love, which is why the ideal family is so exact an analogy. Divine creation is not of its nature winnable. Creation is to be lived, and lived well, with each individual who chooses resurrection making his own unique contribution towards its open-ended and everlasting growth. The mind-to-mind contact of primary thinking is always mutual, shared, involving two or more beings. Bruce Charlton. For some years I have been trying to understand the distinction between what might be termed primary thinking and mundane thinking, in which primary thinking is assumed to come from our real/eternal/divine selves and is objectively real. Primary thinking affects reality, and does so in a direct way, i.e. without needing physical modes of communication. While mundane thinking is the ordinary subjective stuff that grinds away, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes as the stream of consciousness, in response to memories, outer perceptions, external manipulations etc., and in accordance with psychological mechanisms. Mundane thinking is merely subjective in the sense that it is inner, personal, cut off, and, of itself, does not directly influence any other beings or the world in general. For me, this is a matter of absolutely core interest and concern, fundamental to my life and its purpose. It's a subject I cannot leave alone, nor do I want to neglect it. Following on, I have often explored why primary thinking is so difficult, so rare, so hard to initiate and continue. Yesterday it struck me that the answer may be implied by the fact, or assumption, that primary thinking is not private and subjective, but that primary thinking, on the contrary, is linked with, actively participates in, ongoing divine creation. This implies that we are not doing primary thinking unless we are in direct contact with another being. Put negatively, we cannot do primary thinking unless our thinking is being shared with another being. Or, positively expressed, we are thinking primarily when we are in a situation that I've sometimes called direct knowing. What is meant by direct is that there is no intermediary. Normal mundane knowing works by communication, by a message being sent, received, interpreted etc., but there is, indeed there must be, for there to be any knowing at all, potential for a direct, mind-to-mind way of sharing thinking, of simultaneous thinking. But it wasn't until yesterday that I realized this implies, or rather it entails, that primary thinking can only be done in collaboration. We cannot do primary thinking on our own, in our own heads, which is perhaps why primary thinking so often seems impossible no matter how hard we strive for it. Indeed, the striving for it often seems to block primary thinking, presumably because it merely intensifies the cut-off and subjective nature of mundane thinking. What I'm saying is that primary thinking happens, and only happens, when we are in mind-to-mind and direct contact with another being, which might be a living human being, or some other kind of being. This other kind of being could be almost any kind of being, for example a deceased and resurrected human, animal, an angelic spirit, the Holy Ghost. But, as I've said elsewhere, primary thinking is intrinsically good in the sense that it is a participation in divine creation. So, the other kind of being could not be an evil-affiliated being, at least not while such a being is currently actively rejecting of or hostile to God and divine creation. In sum, primary thinking is a dyadic activity at minimum, or could involve more than two beings that are actively, currently, in real time, actually sharing thinking directly and without mediation. To do primary thinking we must first be aligned with God's creative will, and secondarily must mutually be participating in thinking with another God-aligned being. I'm not sure, but it might even be that primary thinking is only possible when there is some degree of a love relationship between beings. This could explain why primary thinking is rare and tends to be brief, but also suggests how it might become more frequent and sustained, in that our striving should be aimed toward discovering the right kind of contact with the right kind of other beings, and this contact essentially needs to happen at a spiritual, not material, level. I'm not suggesting a recipe for primary thinking, and I don't possess one. Indeed, since I am saying that primary thinking is rooted in fundamental mutuality, harmony with divine creation, and indeed perhaps love, it cannot be attained by any standard method or procedure. It is another kind of thing altogether. But maybe this dyadic perspective will stop me from pursuing futile and counterproductive efforts, and perhaps point me in the right direction. Pure Protestants and Bare Salvation. Bruce Charlton. A serious problem that besets what might be called pure Protestants is the minimalist desire for salvation only, a life dedicated to bare salvation, and, ultimately, nothing else matters. This is a consequence of that strand of Reformation theology that focuses, almost exclusively, on salvation by faith, by the grace of God. The pure Protestant inference is that salvation is the only thing that matters, and salvation is achieved by faith in God during this mortal life, indeed specifically faith at the end of this mortal life. For a pure Protestant, as the tree falls, so shall it lie, eternally. In other words, by the state of our soul at the moment of death, so shall our eternal destiny be decided. This has some appalling consequences in practice, because the whole of our mortal lives up to the moment of death is hazardous and futile at best. The optimal thing in a mortal life would be to die at the instant of conversion, to eliminate the risk that subsequent experiences would cause us to backslide and lose faith. Presumably, it is only the prohibition on suicide that prevents this being a normal post-conversion sequela, but anyway, a pure Protestant would be very likely to pray for the deliverance from the threat of damnation by wanting death ASAP, for as long as he has faith. What then should a pure Protestant do with his life? Just about the only valid activities would seem to be, 1. To guard one's faith, and 2. To seek the conversion of others, evangelism. And this is, indeed, the tendency of pure Protestants. Faith is guarded by repeatedly revisiting, reliving, re-experiencing the conversion experience, and by engaging in whatever evangelical activities are deemed, by current theological theories, to be likely to succeed at inducing the maximum number of conversions. That is the theory, or aspiration, yet, looking around at pure Protestants tending churches as of 2025, it clearly does not work, and has not worked for some decades. The reasons is that with pure Protestants there is no such thing as legitimate positive, constructive, creative spiritual activity. And a faith-defending life spent under continuous, increasing, inescapable siege from the extreme and pervasive evil of modern Western societies can only lead to defeat, sooner or later. By denying the value of any this worldly spiritual activity, pure Protestantism creates a values vacuum which is almost inevitably occupied by the hegemonic, secular, materialistic, and nowadays leftist, socio-political morality, which perhaps explains why self-identified Christians of this type are often strikingly successful in terms of status, money, and power. And this brings with it the besetting modern Western sins such as untruthfulness, resentment and despair, and many, if not all, of the characteristic value inversions of totalitarianism. Holding out against some of the inversions of the sexual revolution is one positive thing, but when pure Protestantism eagerly embraces socialism, anti-racism, climate environmentalism, Birdemic healthism etc., then there is no cause whatsoever for self-congratulation. Such churches have been and are decisively assimilated into supporting the strategic demonic agenda. The answer lies in examining the false assumptions at the root of bare salvationism. If God sustains us alive, then there is work He wants us to do, and that work must surely be spiritual in its nature and individual in its focus. It's up to each pure Protestant to discover what that spiritual work must be for himself, personally, here and now. That wonderful story in Acts of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch really ought to end, if bare salvationism was true, and if it were to have a genuinely joyful ending, with the eunuch slipping underwater and drowning, the instant after he was baptized. Rather than, as reported, going on his way rejoicing. And then, according to Ethiopian orthodoxy, as I understand it, returning home to found the church in that country. More on the contact aspect of primary thinking. Bruce Charlton. Continuing from yesterday's post. The idea that primary thinking will only happen if it entails contact with another mind, another being, another real self, fits with some other stuff. For example, if thinking is not in contact, then it is purely personal and subjective, because thinking is something that is done by beings, thinking is an attribute of beings. Thinking isn't an energy or electricity, a physics-like thing or chemical changes, but even if physics/chemistry/biology were a good analogy for thinking, these also require beings. The notion that there can be an autonomous domain of science without regard to living and conscious beings is incoherent, see Owen Barfield's Saving the Appearances. When there is knowledge, there is no escaping consciousness. So you can't have abstract thoughts floating about in reality, without beings to think them. A being that thinks without contact is in a pre-creation situation. Pre-creation there were beings, as it were, floating around in chaos, either unaware or indifferent to one another. It was one of the events that went with divine creation that thinking began to be shared, began to happen as a direct contact between beings, and this, I presume, as a consequence of love. I envisage God, the prime creator, as primordial parents, whose mutual love initiated, and itself was, divine creation. This could also be seen as the beginning of primary thinking, which fits with conviction that primary thinking is a direct form of participation with ongoing divine creation. Also, if primary thinking is, as I believe, a participation in the work of divine creation, then primary thinking cannot be private, cannot be confined to one mind. This also confirms that primary thinking must be something that is happening in more than one mind. Creation can be considered the loving harmony of many beings in such terms as the aims and methods of creation, just like an ideally loving family that remain in harmony through time. The mutual love makes the family cohere, and ensures that aims and methods are sustaining of love. It seems that, if we want to engage in primary thinking, then mind-to-mind, direct, and loving contact is a prerequisite. On mass media censorship and propaganda, if we need to be told major stuff by the mass media, then we are already lost. Bruce Charlton. The UK mass media are censored and controlled, both openly and explicitly, e.g. with regard to the Birdemic descent, or Fire Nation news sites, and by news blackouts with regard to mass immigration, and its consequences. And of course, this censorship and propaganda usage of media is increasing rapidly in scope, completeness, and coercion. There is a great deal of complaint in the alternative media about this, but the complainers are part of the problem. The real problem is that people have come to rely on the mass media for basic information and understanding of the world and their lives. If we need to be supplied by the mass media with information on matters of direct human observation and experience, and if we need to have its implications explained to us by the mass media, then we are already lost. We are lost, because we have handed over responsibility for our fundamental understanding of the nature of things. Even worse, we have chosen to hand over responsibility for our basic assumptions and values to the worst possible external influence, to evil-motivated people, who work in corrupted and converged institutions/organizations/corporations that constitute the bureaucracy of an intrinsically evil totalitarian system. Evil in itself, and which is also in service to the agenda of demonic supernatural powers. Complaints that the mass media are censoring their output are dangerously misplaced. After all, what on earth do people expect from the mass media, in the Western world as it is now? Clearly, the complainers have grossly underestimated the pervasive extremity of evil as it actually is in the world now, and has been for many decades, and worsening. It is not as if knowing more news about the horrendous corruption and thus hatred of the leadership class, has done or would make any difference to their aims and conduct, their desire to corrupt, torment, and spiritually annihilate the nations and their peoples. And it's not as if there are a great mass of good motivated ordinary people who are being hoodwinked by media censorship, but who would otherwise compel significant and positive reforms in public affairs. Ordinary people know, in the sense that the information has passed through their eyes and ears, all kinds of terrible stuff, more than enough. Yet it makes no apparent difference whatsoever to their fundamental assumptions, worldview, values, behaviors. Concerned words are cheap, but human priorities tell a different story. The Western masses are, even if much less evil as the leadership class, deeply complicit and accepting of major strategic agenda themes of the recent decades, and have a system of values that do not rise above the level of the farmyard, i.e. this worldly hedonism, fear-driven avoidance of suffering, addiction to convenience, and craving for continual distraction. There has never, in the history of the world, been such shallow, trivial, and cowardly, because demotivated, people as there are in the West, now. And if people need to be told something so invasive and everywhere, things we all know from observation and our daily personal experiences, and the observations and experiences of our direct social circle, then clearly it is already too late. So, what to do? Forget about effective political action, resistance, reform, that is absolutely not a possibility, when basic understanding and proper motivation is so completely absent, when indeed the actuality is of a widespread and accepted social ethic of value inversion. From where we are as a civilization, spiritually and morally, all social action going forward must be net evil. There is no source for it to be anything else. We must first want what is good, or no good will eventuate. Real understanding follow only upon proper motivation. And then, when it comes to important matters, such understanding follows easily and swiftly. To know and desire a human life based on good aims and conduct, we need not, and certainly should not, depend on anything produced by the mass media. Is following Christ truly a case of myth made fact? Is Christianity, indeed, a myth at all. Bruce Charlton. C.S. Lewis's conversion, as is pretty well known, had much to do with an idea he got, mostly, from J.R.R. Tolkien, that in Christianity myth became fact. In other words, that various of the myths of the ancient world came true in the incarnation, life, death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. This is one reason why Lewis regarded Christianity as the completion of paganism, as well as of Judaism, because in essence it took much of paganism, and transformed it by the addition of specifically Christian values, in particular faith, hope, and charity. I was greatly influenced by this idea in my own conversion to Christianity, but have now come to regard the Christian myth as a misleading distortion of what Jesus actually did and taught. My interpretation nowadays is that Christianity is in its essence about the possibility of following Jesus to resurrected eternal life in heaven, and that this was something new under the sun, an unique possibility, that was, at its core, neither foreshadowed nor foreseen among the ancient religions, neither among Jews nor among pagans. I agree with Lewis that Christianity can be and actually was, especially in the earliest years of Jesus' ministry, and the early period after his ascension, an add-on, easily adopted by Jews and Roman, or Greek pagans alike. But I think the reason for this was not because Christianity was aligned with Jewish expectations of the Messiah, nor that it was a completion of Greco-Roman paganism, but simply because Christianity was a new idea about what happened after death. At least initially, therefore, a new Christian convert could, and apparently did, continue to practice his previous this worldly religion, but with the additional expectation of resurrected eternal life after death. Instead of, for instance, dying in expectation of the underworld ghost life of Sheol or Hades, or returning by some version of reincarnation. Of course, Christianity as it became, developed and accreted very large and complex mythic elements, for example about Jesus' miraculous conception and early life, and expectation of his second coming. So Christianity has mythical aspects with all sorts of derivations and similarities to other mythic religions. But I believe that this was not the case originally, as Jesus lived and taught. And presumably this was a major reason why people found it so very difficult to understand what Jesus was actually telling then, i.e. they could not, or would not, discard their existing myths, such as the Messiah. And either rejected Jesus for failing to embody the prior myth, or adapted the prior myth to fit Jesus, or else adapted what Jesus did to fit the prior myth, as with the second coming notion. I don't know if others agree, but in the fourth gospel I see Jesus trying to tell people something very simple and clear, which they repeatedly fail to comprehend, and this, in part, because they are caught up in already existing religious assumptions including myths. After Jesus' ascension, things should have, perhaps, gone in the direction of the Christian after-death expectation being added onto various existing religions, and then modifying their content in a kind of retrospective way, as the expectation of resurrected heavenly life worked upon the pre-existing religion. However, this did not happen, and instead Christianity became so elaborated by mythic elements that its clear and simple essence was swamped, but also the confident expectation of being able to choose resurrection was inverted, into the necessity to submit to the judgment of God/Christ as King to be fearfully hoping to be chosen as worthy of inclusion in heaven. Only in recent generations has it become conceptually and consciously possible to understand that Christianity does not need to be regarded as a true myth, but instead Jesus' work can be recognized as a cosmic transformation, a new postmortal possibility, a second creation, accessible to those who commit to following Jesus, into and beyond the transformation of resurrection. The country where hello means hello and goodbye. Francis Berger. Aside from discussing Hungarian painters, I haven't spent much time on this blog commenting on Hungarian culture, which is somewhat odd considering that I have spent a decade living here as a somewhat foreigner. Somewhat foreigner because although I have Hungarian roots, go back far enough, they become Germanic, speak the language, and married a Hungarian. I spent the bulk of my life, more than 40 years, in Anglo countries. Hungarian culture is not a big topic on this blog for one simple reason. There's not much to talk about. Since the collapse of communism in 1989, Hungary has gradually and then suddenly morphed into every other place in the West. Except for the turbulent transition decades of the 90s and early 2000s, Hungarian culture has become as bland as unflavored yogurt. The people here are pretty much the same as the people everywhere else in the West. The prevailing public political milieu leans more toward petty bourgeois conservatism, but the overall motivations remain intensely material in scope and nature. If I were to write about Hungarian culture today, I would fill this blog with posts about Hungarians diving headfirst into deep consumer debt to purchase things they don't need, dreaming about their next vacation to whatever hotspot the television celebrities are pushing, and getting tattoos. Lots and lots of tattoos. And that pretty much sums it up. About the only interesting thing in Hungary today is the incorporation of the word hello into the Magyar language. Like Anglos, Hungarians employ the word as an initial greeting. Unlike Anglos, Hungarians also use the word when they say farewell. So, you say hello when you meet someone on the street in Hungary, and when you are ready to leave, you also say hello. Thus, hello serves as a sort of bookend greeting here. Coming or going. Doesn't matter. Hello does the trick either way. And that's about the most interesting aspect of Hungarian culture at the moment. Final participation is a conscious consecration of this moment to our eternal resurrected life. Bruce Charlton. For the past decade or so, I have been trying, in multiple ways, to understand the implications of Owen Barfield's concept of final participation, as being the destiny and proper aim of our spiritual life. Some modern people seem wholly enmeshed in mundane materialist thinking and feel detached and alienated from the living world, trapped inside their own heads. Their only relief is temporarily to forget this in sleep, intoxication, psychosis, and in occasional moments when there is a resurgence of a childlike sense of belonging and involvement. These brief times are what Barfield calls original participation, because they were our original state of consciousness as young children, and also, it is believed, the normal state of the earliest ancestral men. Original participation is, pretty much, the same as Novalis's Sehnsucht and C.S. Lewis's joy, Gurdjieff's self-remembering, Maslow's peak experience, or Csikszentmihalyi's flow state are psychological reductions of the experience. Such moments may be pleasant, indeed there have been times and places, for example some of the Romantic movement around 1800, or the 1960s counterculture. Still ongoing, when many people aspired to abandon modern consciousness and return to original participation. Although this return to the spontaneous, natural, childlike, primitive, here and now consciousness is powerful, and alluring to many people, it has always failed, and must be assumed impossible, except briefly. However, it makes a difference how we regard these brief moments. If they are regarded as merely pleasant psychological states, then original participation can only be therapeutic, like taking a short holiday from the real world of mundane materialism. Yet Barfield asserted that final participation was not just a pleasant interlude, but in some deep sense absolutely necessary if we personally, and our society as well, were to avoid being overwhelmed by evil. However, Barfield was vague about how this might be achieved. He usually advised consulting his mentor Rudolf Steiner's work, but Steiner's techniques seem obviously ineffective, and Barfield never claimed that decades of practicing Steiner medications had led to any very significant effect on Barfield's own thinking in terms of final participation. Indeed, it seems that final participation is not really achievable in a lasting and dominant way. So we seem rather to be trapped between impossibilities. We cannot go back, cannot stay as we are, yet the destined path forward seems blocked. Yet anyone who conceptualizes life as bounded by conception and death will find himself bounded by exactly such impossibilities. We cannot escape the constraints of entropy, and death, and evil. But this is forgetting the reality that we are eternal beings, and this mortal life can be, should be, seen as a finite transitional phase between eternities before and afterwards. Furthermore, and here I depart from Barfield, with his ideas of multiple future reincarnations, a Christian sees his eternal future as including resurrected heavenly life, following after this mortal life. My idea of final participation is that it is the conscious choice to consecrate those moments of original participation. So that when moments of op happen, we choose to regard them as sacred. In such a consecration, the momentary experience of op is consciously recognized as being of potentially eternal significance to divine creation, and is actively taken up into ongoing thinking. This contrasts with, say, the 60s counterculture response, which is to stay inside those op moments, and perpetuate them more as long as possible. I would regard this as akin to a religiously contemplative response to original participation. Contemplative because it is deliberately passive and self-negating. The moment is primary and we intend to stay with it, dissolve into it. This is analogous to the contemplative kind of meditation where people seek a blissful state of consciousness, and try to maintain it for as long as possible. The ideal is of stasis in perfection. But final participation is active and creative, hence is both dynamic, like divine creation, and aspires to join in with and influence ongoing divine creation. And all this is a choice, not a surrender. It is an affirmation of the self, not an attempt to lose the self. It is the choice to be a son of God, a sibling of Jesus, one who wants to join with God in the work of creation, and add to that creative work whatever is unique in himself. So, final participation is an active self-confidence, confidence that by the process of resurrection after this mortal life we can be transformed such as to be able, worthy, and trustworthy of eternal participation in creation. Thus, final participation is a state of being only achievable permanently, as a normal state, after our death, and only among those who have then chosen to follow Jesus through resurrection to everlasting heavenly life. But final participation does have a vital role in this mortal life, because it is when we can add to our resurrected life. Final participation represents our choice to learn from experience in such a way that our immortal soul is permanently transformed. We are talking about our immortal souls, not the conditions of our mortal lives on earth, so the fact that our modern experiences of participation may be relatively few, infrequent, brief, does not invalidate these experiences. Final participation experiences are of permanent value not because they last a long time, but so long as we choose to consecrate them. Consecration would go something like this. 1. Original participation happens. 2. We recognize that it is happening. 3. We acknowledge that this happening is of potentially permanent importance to our resurrected heavenly self. This needs to be done when original participation happens, now, here and now. Not put off until later. If we do not do it at the time of original participation, it will, probably, not be done. However, an intense imagined reliving of the moment could also be used to consecrate that moment retrospectively. Because then the moment is not merely retrospective but a re-experiencing here and now, which is perhaps one reason why we may recollect and meditate on such moments. Why they may last so tenaciously in our memories. The experiences may be re-presenting themselves for consecration. Maybe, if we do this on principle and habitually, then this will act as a positive feedback and establish a spiritual reward system, so that such opportunities will become more frequent. The thing is, we modern men are terribly demotivated, prone to despair, and any spiritual advice that diminishes or delays our gratification seems doomed to fail. Consecrating our moments of original participation generates an immediate spiritual reward as well as a hopeful anticipation. Instead of being a tragic joy, doomed to be short-lived, doomed to be forgotten and lost by age, disease, death. Instead of this, the act of consecration transforms it into a moment of permanent and positive significance. As far as I can understand, only a follower of Jesus Christ who lives in confident expectation of resurrection can do this, and it will not just happen but must be done by conscious choice. All then depends on making that choice. Note, it may be objected that because original participation is spontaneous and natural, it is not necessarily good. This is true, and if an experience is not good, then it cannot and shall not be consecrated to resurrected eternal life, so any such attempt will fail. Christian discernment, knowledge of good and evil, God and that which opposes God, is a necessary part of Christian life, and always applies. The mass of people are, quite literally, spiritually dying of despair, for lack of any genuinely positive purpose in life. It seems obvious that the double negative, for example therapeutic, values that are exclusively propagated, including by nearly all religions, e.g. religions rooted in avoidance of default divine punishment, including most Christian churches, are simply ineffectual, leading to short-termist this worldly hedonism now, and ultimate despair eventually. Arrival in Yercaud. William Wildblood. The reminiscences of my time in India in the 1980s are a sidetrack from the main theme of the blog, but some of their contents do occasionally overlap with that theme and I enjoy the trip down memory lane, so here is another one following chronologically on from the last. We had arrived in India in April and it was now November. The seasons in South India are described as hot, hotter and hottest, and I don't remember which is when, but I have the feeling that the cooler weather was on its way now, as one might expect at that time of year. This was certainly the case in Yercaud, which is a hill station in the Chevreuils 5,000 feet above sea level, so has a very different climate to the plains down below. That was one of the reasons the British developed such towns as Simla in the north and Uttarkhand in the south, but there was a commercial element too, because many of these hill stations were situated in tea-growing areas, though Yercaud, being slightly less elevated, was better suited to coffee. Coffee estates are more visually interesting than tea estates, which resemble nothing so much as neat rows of suburban hedges. Coffee requires both sun and shade, so growers plant trees interspersed with the coffee, and in Yercaud these were often orange trees giving two crops on the same piece of land, as well as two lots of very beautiful and sweet-smelling blossom. The van with all our possessions got to the town of Salem at the foot of the Chevreuil Hills without mishap, which was somewhat surprising given its rickety state. There didn't appear to be any signs to Yercaud, but there was only one road that led to the hills, so we followed it. It was a lovely drive, made more interesting because as you climbed the vegetation changed from typically tropical trees and plants to more temperate zone types. The air became cooler and fresher, and the light sharper. There were monkeys in the trees and scampering on the rocks by the side of the road like these fellows. Roughly halfway up the hill our van broke down. I was surprised it had got this far given its condition, but the driver was unperturbed and soon diagnosed the problem. The trouble was he had to go back to Salem, a good 10 miles away, to get a spare part for the engine. Luckily, there were buses plying this route, and he got on one, leaving Michael and me with the van. Michael then decided he had better get up to Yercaud to make sure the bungalow we had rented was ready for us, and he got on a bus going the other way. These buses came by about once an hour and there was very little other traffic, so I sat there by myself looking out over the hot dusty plains spread below and watching the monkeys until I got sleepy and stretched out on the parapet that bordered the road, presumably to stop cars plunging over the side. They didn't always work. On one occasion while I was living in the area, a bus went over, resulting in several deaths. Michael came back after a couple of hours and then the driver returned with the spare part and we set off up the remainder of the 20 hairpin bends there were on the Gat Road. Here is one of them. And this shows the entrance into Yercaud. Note the cloud and the evergreen trees, showing that we are high up. The name Yercaud comes from two Tamil words meaning lake and forest, and the lake is the first thing you see on arrival. I believe it has now been developed as a tourist resort with fishing and boating, but in my day it was just a lake with some public gardens beside it on one side. We drove to the bungalow Michael had rented, albeit only for a couple of months, as on his previous visit he had also located a property for sale that consisted of a pair of bungalows built on the terraced hillside so that on the lower level you had a well, there was no mains water at the time, and the first bungalow. Then on the next level there was a stretch of garden with a few coffee and banana plants and some orange trees, and finally at the top the main bungalow. It was ideal for running as a guest house. Michael had found this property through someone he had met on his initial trip, who was a Syrian Christian called Therian Matthews. Syrian Christians are from Kerala for the most part and claim religious descent from St. Thomas, who is supposed to have landed on the Malabar coast just a few years after the crucifixion. They are ethnically Indians but use the rites of early Syriac Christianity, hence their name. Therian, the name, is a form of Alexander, and his wife Elizabeth would be good friends to us during our stay in Yercaud, helping us in many ways, though the friendship did end on something of a sour note in what one might call typical Indian fashion. We will come to that another time. The rented bungalow was basic but habitable. There was one large central living area and a couple of bedrooms, but one was small and somewhat grubby, so we used it to store our furniture, mostly bought at auction in Bangalore when we thought we would be living in Whitefield. We shared the other bedroom, and the first night passed reasonably well, though I kept hearing strange noises, but since the house was surrounded by quite thick woods I just thought it was the local nightlife. The noises were louder and seemed closer the next evening, and then all of a sudden in the middle of the night Michael gave a great shout. It seemed something had run over his face and then tried to burrow down into his pajamas. We turned on the lights and there were over a dozen rats in the room, including several perched on a ledge or cornice that ran along the walls. They were looking at us inquisitively. We were clearly interlopers in their territory. I can't remember how we got rid of the rats, but we clearly did, because we stayed in that bungalow for the next few weeks while the purchase of the other property went through. You may be wondering how we bought this other place, given the reason we had left Whitefield was that we, as foreigners, had not been granted permission to buy what was called immovable property, despite being assured by the Indian High Commission in London that we could. The answer is Michael had so set his heart on buying somewhere that he accepted Therian's offer to buy it in his name. Michael supplied the money, which was about £20,000. This was 1980, so that was not what it would be now, but still was reasonable for two bungalows and a fairly decent amount of garden, and Therian's name went on the paperwork. I thought this was somewhat reckless, but Therian seemed friendly and honest, and it was not my money. We moved into the new bungalow in December 1980. It had taken several months, and a lot of work still needed to be done on the two bungalows and the garden, which was heavily overgrown, but we had finally established ourselves in India. Fleeing to places of perceived safety. Francis Berger. Great insights from Dr. Charlton in response to this post. Quote, "This is why it is spiritually dangerous nonsense to spend as much time and effort as people do to decide where is the best, i.e. overall least evil, place in the West to flee to. Essentially everywhere is qualitatively the same overall, all moving in the same direction, but with various differences around that average. I think the proper question we ought to ask is not here is it safest for people to flee, but where should I personally be living, given my unique nature and destiny? This will not be a matter of where I can find the most comfortable life, but a matter of where I ought to be to get, and learn from, my personally most needful experiences. I think we can get to know this by honest spiritual discernment, and seeking the right kind of guidance, and perhaps also get some kind of divine help to act on it, if the answer we get is genuine. End quote. My response, slightly edited. Yes, fleeing to some place of perceived safety is rather pointless these days from a spiritual point of view. However, as you note, moving to some place or other can help, provided the decision is spiritually motivated. I spent most of my adult life moving around, mostly in search of work because there was not much to be had in Canada, where I grew up. Ironically, my journey took me to places that were considerably less safe and comfortable, like the Bronx, New York, and Ashington, England. That aside, when I settled in Hungary, I was driven primarily by a mixture of material and spiritual motivations. On the one hand, I knew I could buy a house in Hungary debt-free. On the other hand, I knew I would be making 1/10 of the salary I made in the West. So I would be comfortable in one aspect but considerably less comfortable in other aspects. For example, I currently earn about €1,000 a month from my university job, if you can believe that. My monthly grocery bill eats up about 60% of that net salary. Not much financial comfort or security there. However, not having a mortgage helps. Anyway, after having lived most of my life in or near big cities, I sought a place where I might be able to touch the earth, so to speak. A place I might feel spiritually alive. I settled in a small village because I wanted my son to have the experience of growing up in a place where he knew everyone and everyone knew him. A place he could call home. I never really had this experience in my childhood. I wanted him to experience those kinds of relationships. And I guess I wanted to experience that as well. Quality over quantity, I suppose. Nevertheless, when I moved here, I remember thinking it was definitely safer and better than the other places I had lived. 3 months later the migrant crisis erupted, and my village, which is near the Austrian border, lies on one of the well-used migrant routes. So much for safety. Then the Birdemic hit, and we were no better off than anyone anywhere else. In some respects, we had it considerably worse. And the war in the Ukraine is right next door. Overall, I would say my decision to settle in Hungary was, at least partially, motivated by material and safety considerations. Yet, I also came here hoping I might find the sorts of experiences you mention, the sorts of experiences that align with my nature and destiny. And I have to say, I do feel more spiritually alive. After a decade living in Hungary, I have realized the perceived material and safety aspects are nugatory. If I had not experienced spiritual aliveness after moving here, I likely would have left and continued on until I found it. Still, I'm not sure this is the right thing. Spiritual aliveness should be a predominantly internal experience that is independent of external factors, but so many places in the West have become spirit-destroying and soul-crushing. In many ways, the whole world has. In this sense, our spiritual aliveness must not depend on external factors. Yet some external factors may help support or enhance one's spirit, provided the motivations are sincere and well motivated. What caused the surprising re-normalization after the 2020 global coup? Birdemic and Peck. Bruce Charlton. I was and am amazed at the remarkable degree of re-normalization within Western societies that followed after the successful early 2020 global totalitarian coup, which was effected under the excuse of the Birdemic and the Giga imposition of the unnecessary, ineffective, harmful Peck. That the significant collapse of the world state was not due to any kind of positive spiritual awakening is obvious from the mass failure to understand and learn from 2020, from continued strategies of Western self-destruction by multiple means, and from the gratuitously destructive, Western-caused, wars that are continually sustained and escalated. My best guess of the cause of totalitarian recession post-Birdemic is of increased dissent among the ruling class, causing loss of governmental cohesion and control. To sustain the 2020 coup required that members of the elite ruling global government would suppress their own selfish short-term inclinations, and instead pursue a long-term group agenda of mass surveillance and population control. But instead, the erstwhile world rulers have broken down into multiple hostile factions, each pursuing a more local agenda. Plus, rampant and accelerating individual-level self-gratifying corruption among members of the elite, for example self-enrichment, and indulgence of spiteful personal resentments, has combined with the runaway factionalism, to destroy the cohesion of the 2020 worldwide totalitarian takeover. In other words, although this relative relief from the tyranny of 2020 is welcome, there is no cause for celebration at good triumphant. There is no positive reason for betterment, the Western trend toward evil has not reversed, and the partial collapse of 2020 global totalitarianism is not a valid reason for civilizational optimism. A few thoughts on Dr. You-Vill-Eat-Ze-Bugs getting thrown under Z-bus. Francis Berger. Remember this lovable Bond villain. Until very recently, he was one of the system's premier apparatchiks. He served as the poster boy for Birdemic, the Great Reset, and every other totalitarian-related machination the system churned out in recent decades. Some went as far as to identify him as the system's mastermind and kingpin. Well, no more. The system unceremoniously decided that the time to throw Dr. You-Vill-Eat-Ze-Bugs had come. And it wasted no time doing exactly that, ensuring that its probes and investigations into whatever it accused Dr. Great Reset of were generously splashed across all the major media outlets, replete with plenty of faux shock and tisk-tisking. Good news, right? Not so fast? Getting excited or hopeful about some system apparatchik getting thrown under the bus is inadvisable and, potentially, spiritually lethal. Any sudden media blitz that overtly criticizes, scrutinizes, re-evaluates, or condemns a system apparatchik should be treated with caution and suspicion. More often than not, all that such media campaigns do is offer false beacons of hope. When the system hangs one of its own out to dry, it does so primarily to maintain or rebuild the public's trust in the system itself. When the system puts one of its own in a difficult or vulnerable situation, it is working to persuade the public that, despite everything, the system remains a force for good, that it is and will actively deal with its corrupt and reprehensible elements whenever and wherever it happens to find them. These sorts of campaigns, broadcast far and wide and splashed across the system's ubiquitous media, are meant to instill a sense of justice being served. They are meant to comfort. They are meant to re-cajole complacency. In reality, the apparatchiks the system publicly hangs out to dry, be they CEOs, politicians, academics, celebrities, royalty, artists, or whatever, may be nothing more than voluntary or involuntary scapegoats and fall guys. If they are voluntary scapegoats, they are rewarded handsomely for the manufactured ordeals to which they agree to subject themselves. If they are involuntary scapegoats, the system will simply and unceremoniously throw them under the bus. Either way, the system's fall guys serve the same purpose all fall guys do: they deflect blame, become focal points for pent-up anger and outrage, and grant the protected party, in this case the system itself, an immense advantage. The system can afford to throw any of its assets under the bus at any given time, and I'm sure we'll see many individuals or entities being steamrolled by buses in the coming weeks/months/years. As detailed above, some of this will be simple fall guy stuff, be it voluntary or involuntary. At other times, the victims might be casualties of infighting, position jockeying, or in-system, low-level warfare. Ultimately, the demonic intelligence behind the system aims to throw everyone under the bus, including its servants. Whatever the case, we should not be surprised by any of it. And we certainly must not regard such things as signs that the system is inherently good, nor should we believe such actions to be proof of systemic reform. All such hopes must be abandoned. The only hope the system can offer now is false hope. Real hope exists only outside of and beyond the system, which is why system distancing is so important.